Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Norway. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you at the conference today, so instead I've invited you to visit me where I work. We're going to talk about economic development and the lack of it. And the story begins, in my case, when I was 18 years old, on top of the biggest garbage dump in Lima, Peru. I was asking myself the question, why is it that the people I observe in Lima, the people who handle the luggage at the airport, the taxi driver, the bus driver, the barber, the people in the restaurants, were all equally efficient as those in Norway, but they were infinitely much poorer. So the question that popped up in my mind was, what is it with a market that rewards people with equal efficiency so differently in different nations on the globe? I thought that when I got back to Norway, I should look this up and find an explanation. Unfortunately, I didn't find an explanation. 40 years after my first encounter with underdevelopment, this book was published. 20 of those years I spent in business, making a living out of free trade. So I'm not against free trade, but I think 500 years of experience shows us that the timing of free trade is very important. If the timing is not perfect, then it's possible for nations to specialize in a comparative advantage in being poor and ignorant. Well, as you can imagine, living here gives a certain distance to day-to-day problems. And when I started looking for development theories, I also found that distance in time could help. Economic theory has not always been as it is today. And particularly, it's important that all nations that are presently rich, for a while, had a completely different theory. So in order to find historical support, I started collecting old economics books and books on economic history. And 40 years and 60,000 volumes later, I know a bit more about what made poor countries rich. The basic question we are facing, and the question we are not very good at answering at the moment, is reflected in this chart. Until the year I visited the garbage dump in Lima, Peru, Somalia was a richer country than Korea. We see from the graph how Korea suddenly took off, and Korea took off because it changed its comparative advantage from a diminishing return activity to an increasing return activity, from producing rice to manufacturing. The dilemma we have today is the obvious gap that we see in the graph between the rich countries and the poor countries. Why do we have two convergent groups, a rich one and a poor one? And why is it so difficult to be in the middle? Why is it so difficult to produce middle-income countries? This is what I'll try to address in this video. The book collection grew from a start of trying to understand poor countries by understanding their economies. I started with the South American countries that I knew best, but I soon found out that the poor countries' reality really responded pretty well to economic theory. They had perfect competition and they had diminishing returns, just like Ricardian trade theory assumes. When I started looking at the history of rich nations, they all showed the same pattern. They had a prolonged period of protecting and nourishing manufacturing industries with increasing returns. And the more I looked, the more surprising the pattern was. No nation had ever got rich without going through this period of protection of increasing returns and technical change. The more famous theoreticians are Friedrich List, the German, and Alexander Hamilton, the American. But there are also theorists in virtually all other countries, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, all over the nations that in different periods of time took the step from poor to rich. This little pamphlet shows the two sides of the debate on the same page. Alexander Hamilton was the person who you can actually ask today, why, Mr. Hamilton, is it that you think that the United States needs a manufacturing industry? And he will give you a long list of arguments. Hamilton's opponent in this kind of theory was Thomas Jefferson. These two kind of policies met in the United States. Hamilton created the first central bank in the United States. Jefferson managed to get it closed. Hamilton was killed in a duel with Jefferson's vice president. We find today, by looking at the history of US industrial policy, that there is a Jeffersonian rhetoric, but behind the Jeffersonian rhetoric there is very much Hamiltonian policy. In American iconography, however, it's clear who won the battle. It was Hamilton who conquered the $10 bill, whereas Jefferson was delegated to the $2 bill, which never circulates. So we can say that the United States is perhaps the most interesting prototype for how to get rich. Rags to riches theory that can be applied also today in poor countries, because the mechanisms over history are the same. Increasing returns, the fact that costs go down as the volume of production goes up, has the same effect in Venice in the 1500s as it has in Silicon Valley today. Imperfect competition, that people get rich by being in industries with high barriers to entry, are still the same. New technology brings higher wages and higher tax incomes. That was understood fully by European ministers of finance in the 18th century, and the fact is still valid today. So the mechanisms are the same, but the contexts are different. So the problem becomes, how does one apply the old principles to the new context? And this is the challenge of economic policy. The Northern European welfare states are an example that many poor countries want to follow. The welfare state was a project to solve what in Europe in the 19th century was called the social question. The social question was all the misery that industrialization had created. So the welfare state was a project to tame industrialization, and a welfare state without manufacturing industry was never contemplated. This is a danger sign for the local traffic, sent to me by a German friend. It means beware of men carrying falling books. And now we go into my office. The main problem with the economic theory on which today's economic world order is based is that this theory, Ricardian trade theory, visualizes international trade as a barter of labor hours. There is no capital, there is no knowledge, and if one accepts this basis, that a labor hour equals a labor hour, well, then free trade can be said as creating factor price equalization, that the prices of capital and of labor all over the world will tend to be the same. There are much more sophisticated theories, but the theory on which the WTO has been based is Ricardo's theory in its most simple version. The alternative economic theory, the one that has made nations one after another take the passage from poor to rich, is based on observations of reality, not on more abstract theories. And the first key observation that was made had to do with the gold that flowed in from Mexico and Peru to Spain in the 16th century. Everybody thought that Spain would get fantastically rich, but the opposite thing happened. Spain got deindustrialized and all the gold ended up in countries where there were no mines. The gold from Spain ended up in large Italian cities like Florence and Venice and in the Dutch Republic. So one can say that the paradox that created economics in the early 1600s was how to explain that all the gold ended up in places where there were no mines. The first person to make an economic theory of this, the first person who made a theory of unequal development, was the Italian economist Antonio Serra from Naples. Antonio Serra's little book was written while he was in jail in Naples for rebellion against the Spanish viceroy. The title of his book is A Brief Treatise on the Causes that May Make Gold and Silver Abound in Countries Where There Are No Mines. Antonio Serra isolated the two main causes of economic wealth. First, increasing returns. Secondly, a synergy of a great division of labor with economic activities that are subject to increasing returns. Increasing returns essentially means that when the production of some item is expanded, the higher the quantity of production, the lower the cost. Serra explains Venice wealth as opposed to Naples poverty by explaining the virtuous circles that are created because of increasing returns. He says a minor miracle happens in Venice because they have such a big traffic, because they have such a big trade, they have a very high volume of production. And then he says, because of this high volume of production, their production costs sink. And because the production costs go down even more, they attract even more customers. And this was the first book where these virtuous circles coming from manufacturing industry and from handicraft are mentioned. Serra also makes the explicit point that this cannot happen in agriculture. Agriculture is subject to the opposite, to diminishing returns. The second important principle is explained in this little pamphlet that actually entered this house yesterday. A discourse on the necessity of encouraging mechanic industry. Little pamphlet published in London in 1689. On page 29 in this book, the author introduces to the paradox of famines, and he says, it is also remarkable that mechanics prevent famine in a nation. This at first sight will appear as a paradox, that the multiplying of mouths that eat corn, whose hands sow none, should yet increase food, which matter of fact demonstrates the truth notwithstanding, for whoever saw a famine in Holland? On the contrary, they who sow none yet supply other parts of the world with corn, which they effect by means of their arts and trade. And here is where the wealth from the Americas, the gold and silver from Mexico and Peru, ended up via Spain. The first economics professor north of Germany was Anders Berg in Sweden, and Anders Berg's book also states the knowledge from 200 years earlier that the real gold mines are not the gold mines but manufacturing industry. So for several hundred years this was accepted knowledge in Europe. When economics got established in England, it was through the work of Adam Smith. And Adam Smith twisted the branch that became economics by reducing both trade and production to labor hours. And it's on this basis that David Ricardo made his trade theory. The problem of trade theory is then that it doesn't distinguish between different economic activities, those that are subject to increasing returns and those that are subject to diminishing returns. So before David Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage should be introduced in a nation, a preceding strategy has always been emulation. Emulation means copy in order to improve upon. So sport is essentially an act of emulation. You try to run as fast as the fastest one. And emulation was also the name of the game in economics. If you live in the Stone Age and you see that the tribe across the river is getting into some new material, they're moving into the Bronze Age, you have the choice of sticking to your comparative advantage in the Stone Age or emulating the neighbors into the Bronze Age. The obvious common sense choice is emulation. The economics that developed after World War II unlearned the historical differences between economic activities. So after the Berlin Wall, the Washington institutions have developed what I call a string of red herrings, of false starts that don't lead to the understanding of development. First, they said, get the prices right. Then, get the property rights right. Then, get the institutions right. Then, get the governance right. Get the competitiveness right. Get the innovation right. Get the entrepreneurship right. The education, the climate, the diseases, the culture. But the missing dimension is get the economic activities right. Classical development economists recognized that poverty was a result of cumulative causations that reinforced each other. After World War II, we saw that mechanism again when the Allied started to deindustrialize Germany under the Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthau Plan had as its goal to make Germany into a pastoral state by removing industry. The plan was a disaster and it was abandoned in March 1947. What should they do with them? Should they shoot them, or should they bring them somewhere else? If so, where? This was the age-old recognition that a state without manufacturing industry has a much, much lower carrying capacity for its population than a manufactured state has. Now we have seen with the shock therapy of the 1980s and 90s a similar effect in many third world countries. The Marshall Plan and later the Havana Charter was based on creating the virtuous circles. Productivity increases is what creates growth, and they are activity specific. There are more of them in some activities than in others. Productivity increases produce higher real wages. Alternatively, in the third world, you just lower export prices at the same rate of productivity increase. The really virtuous circles start when you create higher demand, higher savings, higher possibility for taxation, better health, education, and labor-saving technology pays off. Then a large scale of production produces highly diversified economy and systemic synergies, high investments and higher profits. If the fruits of technical change do not produce any increase in real wages, you have underdevelopment. So in a sense, development is an exercise in imperfect Schumpeterian dynamic competition. The higher demand and higher savings result in large scale of production, highly diversified economy and systemic synergies. Exactly the type of qualities that have been identified with economic development for the last 400 or 500 years. Higher investments and higher profits, all this produces economies of scale and scope. My claim is that premature integration into world trade and shock therapy has created Morgenthau plan conditions in many poor countries, from Mongolia via Africa to many South American countries. If I were to draw a drawing of economic development, it would look like this. Economic development consists of sequences of productivity explosions, of periods where there is a very rapid productivity increase in one or very few economic activities. The nations that have managed to grab these productivity explosions have been the ones developing. The first such productivity explosion that's easily documented is the mechanization of cotton spinning during the first industrial revolution. Here, in a short period in the late 18th century, we saw productivity increase of almost 30% per year in a brief period. Drawing the learning curve in a different way, we can see the same type of productivity increase here in the example of the learning curve for shoes in the United States. In 1850, it took 15 and a half hours to make a standardized pair of shoes. In 1900, it was down to 1.7, 1923, 1.1, and 1936, 0.9. Rich nations specialize where the learning curve are steep and export goods from steep learning curves, whereas poor nations tend to produce where the learning curves are low. The typical maquilas in Mexico are the labor-intensive activities where there is no more learning in the United States. Colonialism was in effect a technology policy. Colonies were nations where manufacturing and such productivity explosions, such steep learning curves, were not to take place. A typical quote is from an English economist in 1729, and it's not as racist as it sounds, because this is the policy that England also had towards Ireland. That all Negroes shall be prohibited from weaving either linen or woolen, or spinning or combing or wool, or working at any manufacture of iron, further than making it into pig or bar iron. That they be also prohibited from manufacturing of hats, stockings, or leather of any kind. Indeed, if they set up manufactures, and the government afterwards shall be under a necessity of stopping their progress, we must not expect that it will be done by the same ease that now it may. So colonialism was to keep poor countries in providing natural resources and in diminishing returns industries. A further argument along this line is found when the people in the plantations, that is in the colonies, want to have their own manufacturing industry. Then, says Matthew Deckers, we should tempt them with a free market for their agricultural products all over Europe. This will betake themselves to raise them, to answer the prodigious demand of that extensive free trade, and their heads be quite taken off from manufacturers, the only thing which our interests can clash with theirs. So already in the 18th century, one policy to keep poor countries from manufacturing industry was to give them free trade in agricultural goods. That did not produce wealth in the 18th century, and it does not produce wealth now either. Since my first visit to Peru more than 40 years ago, I have been there virtually every year. And I spent some time there in the 70s, and in the 70s, as we can see on this graph, real wages rose by almost 50%. This is a graph showing the development of wages in Peru, and in red, the development of export. We see that Peruvian wages hit their highest points in terms of real wages in the mid-70s with a very inefficient and heavily protected manufacturing sector. We can see how real wages fall as the nation opens up. Trade seems to be looking very good, very high increase in trade. At the same time, the real wages in the whole country are falling. And we see that this fall continues with an interruption all the way to 1990, after which real wages flatten off, but the real wages have been reduced by more than 50%. Exports go up and skyrocket, as we see. So from the point of view of many economists, Peru is a great success story. From my point of view, it's a great failure because people's real wages have been more than halved. So the problem here is to explain why Peru had the highest wages ever in a period when they did everything wrong, when they protected an inefficient manufacturing sector. How radical are the suggestions I'm making? They are not more radical than the situation was in Norway and in Western Europe in general when I grew up. This means more profit opportunities locally for local businesses. In the short run, it makes it more profitable to operate in the poor countries. In the long run, this will also benefit the rich countries because the markets will be so much bigger. This is what the Americans said to the English in the 1820s. Let us industrialize like you did, because when we have industrialized, we'll buy much more from you than we do now. We won't buy spades from you, but we will buy machinery to produce spades. This is the logic that capitalism can upgrade everyone in a sequence, just as was done in Asia under the flying geese paradigm. This means that UNCTAD will play the same kind of role like it did in its early days, and it means that the world economic order will look like it did in the 1950s and early 60s. In 2008, we celebrate two events when economic policy has turned away from Ricardian economics. The first time was in 1848, 160 years ago, when John Stuart Mill recounted on Ricardo's trade theory on a very important point. Nations need infant industry protection in order to get into increasing returns activities. He says, if we do not understand the workings of diminishing return, we do not understand underdevelopment. We do not understand poverty. The second celebration, or the second anniversary that we celebrate this year, is exactly 100 years later by pure chance. In 1948, all the members of the United Nations unanimously approved the Havana Charter, which was an economic charter for the world based on the principles of the Marshall Plan that was proving to be so successful in Europe. The Havana Charter puts employment and industrialization as priorities before free trade. And it's clear that when a nation has entered into the virtuous circles of increasing returns and technical change, free trade is an absolute necessity. But before then, it may cause a nation to create a comparative advantage in being poor. The principles behind this, all the time from 1613 and even before, until this very day, are the same. It is increasing versus diminishing returns, it is synergies between a large division of labor, and it is technical change. But technical change, as English economist Hans Singer proved to us more than 50 years ago, have very different effects in increasing returns and in diminishing returns industries. The principles are the same. The gravity is the same, but the context is new. So the challenge is how to apply the principles that have been so successful for so long in today's context. It's not easier than before. It is probably more difficult, but it has proved to be the only way to bring